Okay, let me welcome for the general audience, first of all, for not leaving us alone tonight. We are happy to proceed our second talk of our series that Kant and the Needs of Reason. And in our first session, we had the chance to host Professor Andrew Chignell. And today we are also very happy to host a legendary name for us, Paul Guyer. So as Turkey Kant Society, we are very pleased that he didn't, he accepted our invitation. So we're happy and excited about this. Okay, as Kantians, maybe I can start by introducing our guest, but I think there is no need to introduce much Professor Guyer, but just, to follow the rules and regulations, let me start with a brief introduction. As we all know, Professor Guyer has written a dozen books on Kant and Kantian themes, but further than that, he translated and edited several works of Kant's into English, and in particular, for the Anglophone world and for the countries in which English is the most common foreign language, including Turkey, Professor Guyer's contribution to Kant studies is indeed indispensable. And he has been our first teacher in studying Kant, and this dark blue Cambridge series, which is associated with Professor Guyer, has been our guidebook to the world of Kant. In addition to his works on Kant, Guyer also published on many other figures in the history of philosophy, including Locke, Hume, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and others. And his other areas of specialty also include aesthetics, and his 3-volume work on a history of modern aesthetics was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. So as I mentioned, he wrote numberless books and articles on these broad topics, and we would run out of time if we try to list them. But nevertheless, I would like to refer to at least 3 of them by name. Kant and the Claims of Taste, 1979, Kant and the Claims of Knowledge, 1987, Kant on Freedom, Law, and Happiness. So those are such neat and groundbreaking studies that any Kant scholar have referred or would refer to them at one point in their career. So I'd like to mention them. And I have a technical reminder before we start. The event will be recorded and it will be shared on our YouTube platform. And also after the talk, we will have a half an hour Q&A session. And after all these informations, let me thank Professor Guyer sincerely for his monumental contribution to Kant studies, but also for accepting our invitation and being with us tonight. Floor is yours, Professor Guyer.
There we go. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes, perfectly well.
Good. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. Istanbul is actually one of my favorite places in the world. I'm sorry I can't be there today in person, can only be here by electronics, but that's how things are at the moment. This paper is entitled Taste and Morality in the 18th Century. It's actually somewhat of a survey piece and discusses quite a number of authors, both British and German. So we talk about Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Hume, Kames, Mendelssohn, Sulzer, Kant, and Schiller. And obviously I don't have time today to cover all of that material. So I'm going to read you the introduction, some pages about Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, who I think were always extremely important for Kant, and then the part about Kant himself. So, as I'm sure many of you know, the philosophical subfield of aesthetics was baptized by Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten in 1735, although it had been a central part of philosophy since the time of Plato and Aristotle. Following Baumgarten's early work, aesthetics was an intensively plowed field in German academia and letters for the remainder of the 18th century and ever since. The word aesthetics was not adopted into English for another century, but even without a title, the subject was just as intensively pursued in 18th century Britain as in Germany. A central topic of concern for many of the 18th century authors in this field, especially but not exclusively in Britain, was the issue of a standard of taste. The question, that is, whether there are grounds for expecting consensus in judgments about beauty in general or about art in particular, at least under optimal circumstances, and if so, what criteria for universally valid judgments of taste might be. Most writers took it for granted that there must be a standard of taste and asked only how to ground and apply it. Hume, for example, although not ordinarily inclined to take much of anything for granted, thought that even though the axiom that, quote, beauty is no quality in things themselves, it exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty, has passed into the proverb that it is fruitless to dispute concerning tastes, which in turn, he continues, seems to have attained the sanction of common sense. Nevertheless, he continues, there is certainly a species of common sense which opposes it, at least serves to modify and restrain it, according to which, continuing to quote from Hume, whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogleby, some poet nobody remembers now, and Milton, who would be thought to defend no less an extravagance than if he had maintained a molehill to be as high as Tenerife or a pond as extensive as the ocean, unquote. Hume went on to defend the foundation of a standard of taste in the consensus of the best qualified critics of art over time, whose judgments should be exemplary for the rest of us. But why should it have been taken for granted as a defensible species of common sense that even if only under optimal or idealized conditions, everyone should like the same things, whether in the arts or in a more general aesthetic sphere that includes nature as well? Why would not people have thought, especially in Leibnizian Germany, where no two substances were thought to be exactly alike, and every monad was thought to represent the universe from its own point of view, that different individuals, each with their own physiology and their own history, would naturally develop explicable and reasonable differences in their aesthetic preferences, as in all sorts of other aspects of their personalities and characters? Why would not everyone have thought, as Johann Gottfried Herder wrote in 1766, that, quote, since the whole sensation depends on the constitution of the nerves pertaining to feeling, no human being is quite exactly in agreement in feeling with another, because it cannot easily be the case that in two human beings, the whole structure of the nerves is entirely tuned in a single way, unquote. And beyond that, neither can the upbringing, education, and experience of any two individuals, even siblings or twins in a single family, be entirely the same. Therefore, quote, so many people, still quoting from Herder, so many people have a stubbornly idiosyncratic sense of feeling, which noticeably deviates now in this matter and now in that from the sensation of another person, unquote. Or, as Herder wrote a few years later, quote, no human being, no country, no people, no history of a people, no state is like another, and consequently the true, the beautiful, and the good is not alike in them either, unquote. Indeed, why would not anyone think that a world in which, after an ideal aesthetic education, everyone liked all and only the same things would be, at the least, a very boring world? At worst, an aesthetic version of the brainwashed world of Orwell's 1984. In The Analytic of the Beautiful, in his 1790 critique of the power of judgment, Kant made it seem as if the necessary existence of a standard of taste and the philosophical necessity of providing a secure foundation for judgments of taste that can legitimately claim what he calls subjectively universal validity, that is, validity for all subjects who would properly respond to and judge a particular object of taste, follows from the very language that we use in expressing aesthetic preferences. Kant writes that although, with regard to what is agreeable to the mere taste of the tongue, palate, and throat, or even merely to someone's eyes and ears, such as particular colors or the tones of particular instruments, it is perfectly normal to say it is agreeable to me and to accept the principle everyone has his own taste. With the beautiful, Kant says, it is entirely different. It would be ridiculous, he continues, if someone who prided himself on his taste thought to justify himself thus. This object, the building we are looking at, the clothing someone is wearing, the poem that is presented for judging, is beautiful for me, for he must not call it beautiful if it pleases merely him, unquote. Continuing to quote, hence he says that the thing is beautiful and does not count on the agreement of others with his satisfaction because he has frequently found them to be agreeable with his own, but rather he demands it from them and rebukes them if they judge otherwise, unquote. Of course, the beliefs of individuals are formed in many ways by the language that they learn to speak at home, on the streets, and playground, and in school. But should we believe that the philosophical assumptions and beliefs of an entire temporally extended linguistic community are simply forced upon it by a language that they happen to speak, as opposed to their philosophical views, at least over time, shaping that language? Isn't that the fallacy that the later Wittgenstein was warning us against, even if the contemporaneous ordinary language philosophers with whom Wittgenstein was sometimes lumped together, such as J.L. Austin, seemed to accept it? Could anyone have really thought that there must be a standard of taste and the central task of aesthetics should be to discover and justify that standard just because it sounds funny to say that something is beautiful or schön or belle to me? Well, Kant did not actually believe that language alone justifies anyone demanding agreement in taste from everyone else and rebuking them for their failure to agree, nor, I suggest, did other philosophers who, unlike Herder, accepted the necessity of a standard of taste, do so on merely linguistic grounds. Later in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant writes that the universal communicability of aesthetic judgments, aesthetic responses, and judgments of taste, quote, must involve an interest for us, which, however, one is not justified in inferring from the constitution of a merely reflective power of judgment, if one is to be able to explain how it is that the feeling in the judgment of taste is expected of everyone as if it were a duty. End of quotation. Kant then argues that in spite of the fact that our judgments of beauty must be made independently of any interest in the existence of their objects, the demand for agreement in judgments of taste can be grounded only in what he calls an intellectual, that is to say, a moral interest in the existence of beautiful objects, by which he means, in the first instance, beautiful objects in nature, that is, the beautiful shapes of wildflowers, birds, insects, and the like, but which he will subsequently allow includes works of fine art in virtue of their moral content, which are, after all, products of nature, although in this case of human nature. The demand for a standard of taste and for its justification, in other words, is not grounded merely in the language of aesthetic discourse, but in morality. I will come back to the details, or some details of Kant's account, but first I want to establish that Kant's conviction of the assumption of I want to establish that Kant's connection of the assumption of a standard of taste to morality was not idiosyncratic, but characteristic of many thinkers in the 18th century. So now, just to give two examples, I will talk for a few minutes about the English aristocrat Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and his self-appointed defender, the Scots-Irish clergyman and Professor Francis Hutcheson. Excuse me. Shaftesbury is often thought to have commenced modern British aesthetic theory with his introduction of the concept of the disinterestedness of judgments of taste, which is in turn thought to entail the independence of judgments of taste from moral judgment. Shaftesbury did posit the disinterestedness of judgments of taste, but in fact only to illustrate the sense in which moral judgments themselves are disinterested, not to separate judgments of taste from moral judgments. That is, Shaftesbury enlisted what he took to be an obvious feature of judgments of taste, namely that they are not judgments that possession or consumption of their object would be personally beneficial, in his anti-Hobbesian campaign against explicating moral values in terms of mere prudence or rational self-interest. What Shaftesbury argues is that, quote, being taken with the beauty of the ocean, it would be absurd to seek how to command it, like some mighty admiral, for one's own advantage, and equally absurd to suppose that, quote, the enjoyment of the prospect of a delicious vale would require the property or possession of the land, unquote. That is, the enjoyment of beauty does not depend upon the possibility of personal use, and neither does the approbation of the morally good depend upon the potential satisfaction of self-interest. Pleasure in beauty and approbation of the good are analogous in this regard. In fact, Shaftesbury's view, in Shaftesbury's view, these two forms of approbation are more than analogous. They are at bottom much the same. Both are pleasure in the orderly structures of the universe, and beyond that, in the divine intelligence that is the more or less direct source of all order and harmony in the universe. Shaftesbury's education had been supervised by John Locke, but his deepest intellectual affinities were with the Cambridge Platonists Benjamin Whichcote and Ralph Cudworth, who held, like all Neoplatonists, that the true, the beautiful, and the good are all ultimately the same. Shaftesbury's larger view is apparent in a passage immediately preceding what has just been quoted. Here, his spokesman, Theocles, in the dialogue The Moralist, says that, quote, whatever in nature is beautiful or charming is only the faint shadow of that first beauty, every real love depending on the mind and being only the contemplation of beauty, either as it really is in itself or as it appears imperfectly in the objects which strike the sense. How can rational mind be satisfied with the absurd enjoyment which reaches the sense alone, unquote. That is, as Socrates argued in Plato's Symposium, the beauty perceived by the senses in ordinary objects is ultimately meant to lead the mind to the pleasurable contemplation of something higher, the form of the good in Plato's case, or the divine mind in Shaftesbury's. Or as Theocles states more fully several pages on, there are three degrees of or orders of beauty. First, the dead forms, which bear a fashion and are formed, whether by man or nature, but have no forming power, no action or intelligence. Next, as the second kind, the forms which form, that is, which have intelligence, action, and operation. Here, therefore, there is double beauty, for here is both the form, the affective mind, and mind itself. And then there's the third order of beauty, which forms not only such as we call mere forms, but even the forms which form. For we ourselves are notable architects in matter and can show lifeless bodies brought into form and fashioned by our own hands. But that which fashions even minds themselves contains in itself all the beauties fashioned by those minds and is consequently the principal source and fountain of all beauty. End of quotation. So some beautiful objects, such as the seas or mountains and valleys, are, in Shaftesbury's view, fashioned directly by God, and so is their beauty. Others are fashioned by human beings, such as statues and edifices, or for that matter, families and states. And when they are beautifully formed, the proximate cause of their beauty is human, but humans themselves are, of course, fashioned by God. So the ultimate cause of all beauty is God, and enjoying or admiring any form of beauty, again, this is all still Shaftesbury, we are ultimately admiring the divine mind. When we are admiring the beautiful form of a physical object, whether a single leaf or the solar system, or the harmony of a social organization, whether a family or a larger society, we are admiring harmonious organization and ultimately the mind that is the source of all harmony. For Shaftesbury, there's no radical separation between beauty and goodness or between our judgments of either. On the title page of the first edition of his Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue in 1725, which is divided into Treatise 1 on Beauty and Treatise 2 on Virtue, Francis Hutcheson announced that in it, quote, the principles of the late Earl of Shaftesbury would be explained and defended against the author of the Fable of the Bees, unquote. That is, Bernard Mandeville, who was seen at that time as another Hobbesian egoist. Hutcheson argues that our response to beauty should be considered a kind of sense because it is immediate and it is not affected by considerations of advantage or disadvantage. He says, for as in the external sensations, no view of interest will make an object grateful, nor view of detriment, distinct from immediate pain in the perception, make it disagreeable to the sense, unquote. He makes it more explicit than did Shaftesbury that what he means is that our perception of and pleasure in beauty is independent of self-interest. He says, hence it plainly appears that some objects are immediately the occasions of this pleasure of beauty, and that we have senses fitted for perceiving it, and that it is distinct from that joy which arises from self-love upon prospect of advantage, unquote. Like Shaftesbury, Hutcheson leads the reader from the acceptance of the disinterestedness of the perception of beauty to the anti-Hobbesian recognition that judgments of moral goodness and worth are not veiled judgments of self-interest either. The moral sense, analogous to the sense of beauty, approves of the disinterested intention to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and in its judgments of the moral worth of particular agents, discounts their benevolent intentions by any amount of self-interest that contributes to their actions. Two differences between the views of Hutcheson and Shaftesbury, however, might seem to introduce more daylight between judgments of taste and moral judgments in Hutcheson's theory than in Shaftesbury's. First, Hutcheson does not make God the ultimate object of both aesthetic pleasure and moral approbation, nor does he make judgments of taste and of morality ultimately identical in that regard. Although as the pious Presbyterian clergyman that he was, Hutcheson certainly insists that God is the ultimate or final cause both of our own minds with their proclivity toward beauty, or unity amidst variety as he analyzes beauty, and of the world that contains so much beauty, and that we ought to be grateful to God for the existence of that beauty. Second, and perhaps more important, Hutcheson draws a distinction that Shaftesbury did not, namely between original or absolute beauty and relative or comparative beauty. The former, original or absolute beauty, is grounded in the uniformity amidst variety that we may perceive in objects considered without reference to anything else, for example, in their shapes, while the latter arises from a harmonious relationship between an object and something else, paradigmatically between a representation and something that it represents. At least in the case of absolute beauty, which is grounded in such things as geometrical form, and which does not lead the mind directly to thoughts of God, it might seem as if there could be no direct connection, let alone identity, between aesthetic and moral judgment in spite of their common feature of disinterestedness. However, like many authors of his time, Hutcheson regards poetry as the highest form of art and the impact of poetry as a form of relative rather than absolute beauty depends upon its moral content and the way it stirs our moral feelings. He writes that, quote, "We are more nearly touched and affected," unquote, by poetry that presents morally flawed characters like ourselves, quote, "since in them we see represented in the persons of others the contrasts of inclination and the struggles between the passions of self-love and those of honor and virtue, which we often feel in our own breasts," unquote, and which we must learn to master in order to become morally better ourselves. And for this reason, it is the moral sense engaged by the relative beauty of poetry, rather than the more formal sense of beauty engaged by absolute beauty, whether in nature or art, that affects us most deeply and is most important to us. So he continues, "We shall find this sense," that is the moral sense, "to be the foundation also of the chief pleasures of poetry." We hinted in the former treatise, that is treatise 1 on beauty, at the foundation of delight in numbers, measures, metaphors, similitudes. But as the contemplation of moral objects, either of vice or virtue, affects us more strongly and moves our passions in a quite different and more powerful manner than natural beauty, so the most moving beauties bear a relation to our moral sense and affect us more vehemently than the representation of natural objects in the liveliest descriptions. Dramatic and epic poetry are entirely addressed to this sense, that is the moral sense, and raise our passions by the fortunes of characters distinctly represented as morally good or evil, unquote. So, while Hutcheson does recognize the existence of aesthetic responses and judgments that are analogous but not identical to moral responses and judgments, what are for him the most powerful and important of our aesthetic responses and judgments, those two works of poetic art, are intimately connected to our moral judgments and our moral life more generally. These works of art, although we enjoy their more purely formal features, such as measures and metaphors, affect us most deeply through their moral content, and therefore the response of our moral sensibility to their content. The independence of aesthetic from moral judgment, thus in Hutcheson's view, is present in some genuine cases of beauty, but not in the most powerful and important cases of art. Now, Hutcheson is at pains to establish the possibility of, quote, "the universality of the sense of beauty among men," unquote, by which he means human beings generally. He appeals to experience, that is, his argument is empirical, in order to establish that all men are better pleased with uniformity amidst variety in the simpler instances than the contrary, even when there's no advantage observed attending it. He explains away apparent diversity among tastes by saying that some people are satisfied with lesser degrees of beauty when, because of environment and education, they are unacquainted with greater degrees of beauty or the possibility of such. He says, "We are indeed often mistaken in imagining that there is the greatest possible beauty where it is but very imperfect, but still it is some degree of beauty that pleases. A Goth, for instance, is mistaken when from education he imagines the architecture of his country to be the most perfect, and a conjunction of some hostile ideas may make him have an aversion to Roman buildings," unquote. The implication is perhaps too obvious to need to be stated that with further or better education, those satisfied with lesser degrees of beauty can come to prefer greater degrees. Nor does Hutcheson accompany his discussions of the impact of poetry on our moral sentiments in both treatises of the inquiry with any demand that everyone ought to experience poetry, let alone find the same poems most beautiful because of the moral benefits of such experience. He seems content to let the moral value of poetry speak for itself. Okay, so with that background, now I'm going to turn to Kant. But one thing I would say before I start reading is that we know that Kant was took Hutcheson very seriously in the 1760s. And in fact, I would suggest that the literary structure of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, even from the middle of the 1780s, is actually quite deeply influenced by the structure of Hutcheson's treatise on virtue, the second half of his first book. I won't go into any detail about that, but the point that I want to extract from this discussion of Hutcheson is that we actually see the same pattern in Kant's aesthetics as we see in Hutcheson's discussion, as I've just described it. That is, Kant is going to begin with the conception of beauty as a feature of pure form. But when he comes to talk about art, he emphasizes its moral content and the impact on us of moral content. And he suggests that there needs to be some kind of moral interest in art in order for us actually to demand agreement from others. It's not a pure epistemological matter. Okay, that's sort of a suggestion of what I'm going to be arguing now. As did Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, Kant begins his exposition of his theory of taste with the stipulation that judgments of taste are without any interest, or as we say, disinterested. Actually, just like Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, Kant does not actually use the word disinterested. And he's remained famous for this claim. By this, Kant means that aesthetic response itself, or our pleasure in a beautiful object, which will, and he'll subsequently expand his account to take in this case of the sublime as well, is independent of any interest in the existence of the object and is solely a response to the representation of the object. And he means also that our judgment that the object is beautiful must be made independently of any interest. In this regard, our response to and judgment of beauty differs from those to the agreeable, that is what merely gratifies our senses, and the good, including whatever is judged to be good, whether from a moral or merely prudential point of view. So Kant says that taste is the faculty for judging an object or a kind of representation through a satisfaction or dissatisfaction without any interest, unquote. Yet he also stipulates that a judgment of taste claims, quote, subjectively universal validity. That is, not the objectively universal validity, ending a quote, of a property that is valid for all members of some class to which the object belongs, but rather the agreement of all judges in optimal conditions that they too find pleasing some particular object that one finds beautiful oneself. He says, when we call something beautiful, the pleasure that we feel is expected of everyone else in the judgment of taste as necessary. Kant then argues that the dual requirements of disinterestedness and subjectively universal validity can be satisfied if pleasure in beauty is due to the free play of the cognitive powers of imagination and understanding, or, quote, mutual subjective correspondence of the powers of cognition with each other, unquote, or a, quote, composition of the manifold, unquote, of intuitions contained in the representation of an object, such, quote, as the imagination would design in harmony with the lawfulness of the understanding in general, if it were left free by itself, unquote. Now, this concept of free play, which was already hinted at by Lessing and Mendelssohn, among others, is highly metaphorical. But it seems to mean that we take a special pleasure in the feeling that the impressions presented by a beautiful object are coherent in the way that the understanding always demands, but without that coherence being dictated by any determinate concept that is actually applied by the understanding. Thus, Kant sums up his theory of free play by stating that, quote, that is beautiful, which is cognized without a concept as the object of a necessary satisfaction, unquote. Now, by this, he cannot mean that we do not subsume beautiful objects under any concepts at all. We can always recognize and refer to them as a flower or a rose, or some particular kind of flower or particular kind of rose even, a string quartet or a Haydn string quartet or a Haydn string quartet from Opus 76, and so on. But what he means is, so we can refer to beautiful objects under determinate concepts or by using determinate concepts. But what Kant means is that no such concept that we apply to the object explains its beauty or entails its beauty. Thus, he means that the beautiful object displays a harmony or coherence that goes beyond anything that is necessary just to satisfy the criteria for the application of any particular concept. Kant's confidence that this explanation justifies the claim to subjectively universal validity inherent in any judgment of beauty is based on his assumption that the cognitive powers must work the same way in any normal being, human being, unless they are distorted by the presence of some personal interest. This is a questionable assumption, although I'm not going to question it here. Instead, I'll mention two further features of Kant's theory before I turn back to the question about the relation between aesthetic and moral judgment. First, the theory of beauty and judgments of taste, thus far expounded, is the theory of what Kant calls free beauty, as opposed to adherent beauty. Free beauty, exemplified by such paradigm cases as the beauty of a natural object, such as a flower or a shell. And here you have to ignore the fact that most of our garden flowers have been intensively bred and are only partly natural objects. Is beauty recognized and enjoyed without a concept? Adherent beauty is the experience of which presupposes a concept, specifically a concept of the intended function of an object, such as that of a church or a racehorse. Although Kant does not say whether the constraints inherent in the intended function of the object just restrict the area within which the free play of imagination and understanding may take place, or actually somehow enters into that free play. The importance of the distinction, that is, between free and inherent beauty, is that it reveals that Kant's initial analysis of beauty and taste starts with the simplest possible case in order to identify what is essential to aesthetic experience, namely some form of free play, but can then be made more complicated. And we see the consequences of this when we come to Kant's account of fine art. And I should mention, just to avoid any possible confusion, that although nowadays, when, at least in English, when we use the expression fine art, that's really taken to refer to visual art, painting and sculpture. When Kant uses his expression, schöne Kunst, which we translate as fine art, that refers to the whole range of the arts as identified in the 18th century system of the arts, that is to say, literature, for which poetry is usually the stand-in, but we would take more broadly, music, painting, sculpture, possibly dance, architecture as a special case, etc. So when Kant uses the expression fine art, it doesn't just mean visual art. And in fact, for him, poetry is the foremost of the fine arts. Okay, that's a parenthesis. So my second point here is that Kant does not confine aesthetic response and judgment to the beautiful. He also, as I suggested earlier, recognizes the experience of the sublime. The experience and judgment of the sublime bear certain similarities to those of the beautiful, but they also have significant differences. The most important difference is that while the beautiful supposedly involves a cognitively non-standard relation between imagination and understanding, in the experience of the sublime, the imagination is related primarily to reason. Following a well-established tradition, although with his own twist, Kant recognizes a distinction between two kinds of sublimity. In his terminology, the mathematical and the dynamical sublime. Unlike experiences of beauty, the experiences of these two forms of the sublime are not unalloyed pleasures. Rather, they are experiences first of pain and only then of pleasure. This is because in each case, imagination attempts to comprehend something it cannot, which is painful, but then the subject at some level recognizes that it is his own reason that imposes the task of comprehension that the imagination cannot fulfill, and it is pleasurable to feel the power of our reason. Specifically, in the case of the mathematical sublime, the imagination attempts to take in as a whole some magnitude of mountains, seas, starry skies, and so on, which is too vast for it, which makes it feel frustrated. But then we feel that it is our own theoretical reason which is setting this task for the imagination, which makes us feel good. In the case of the dynamical sublime, the imagination, or here precisely our sensible being, feels threatened by some overwhelming natural power, waterfalls, overhanging cliffs, and so on. But then we recognize that our own practical reason, our moral power of choice, is not threatened by mere physical challenges. In each case, we presumably must feel the power of our own reason rather than conceptualize it in order for the experience to count as aesthetic, even though it obviously has some particular conceptual or propositional content, but Kant does not, in fact, make this point explicit. Now, there are many interpretative difficulties for Kant's accounts of the beautiful and the sublime, but what I have said should be enough for my main purpose, that is, understanding the moral significance of aesthetic experience in Kant's eyes, in spite of its disinterestedness. On this score, he has a number of things to say. First, he says that the experience of, quote, the beautiful prepares us to love something, even nature, without interest, the sublime, to esteem it even contrary to our sensible interests. This statement does not require aesthetic experience to have specifically moral content, although on Kant's account, the experience, at least of the dynamical sublime, does have moral content. It rather says that aesthetic experience prepares us for or helps develop capacities that we need for moral purposes. Morality requires us to act out of motives other than self-interest. Sometimes, certainly not always, but sometimes even to act against our self-interest, to sacrifice our own interest to the interest of a larger whole. And learning how to do this in the aesthetic case, apparently, so Kant seems to think, strengthens our ability to do so in the moral case. Although Kant nowhere says that learning how to love independent from or contrary to self-interest in the aesthetic case is a necessary condition of learning how to do so in the moral case. Kant's present claim confirms that just as for Shaftesbury, for him, the disinterestedness of aesthetic experience is above all independence from self-interest, for that is what morality requires of us and aesthetic experience prepares us for. That is to say, aesthetic experience needs to be independent from self-interest, but it does not need to be independent from the interest of morality, which of course is not a form of self-interest. Next, focusing specifically on natural beauty, Kant argues that we take what he calls an intellectual interest in the existence of such beauty because we are interested in any trace or sign that nature is hospitable to the objective reality of our ideas. That is, we are non-selfishly interested in the possibility of realizing our moral ideas in nature, but above all, of course, in our own nature. But we can take nature's accommodation of our sense of beauty in the form of the natural existence of beautiful objects as a general sign of nature's accommodation of our concerns, including our moral concerns, and we take pleasure in this evidence. This does not require that the experience of beauty have any directly moral content. It is the experience of beauty, rather than any content of the beautiful object, that has the alleged moral benefit. The same is true in the case of another claim that Kant makes, namely that the experience of beauty, and here again he seems to have natural beauty in mind, makes beauty a, quote, symbol of the morally good, unquote, because of a number of parallels with moral experience, above all that the experience of beauty is an experience of freedom, although freedom of the imagination without rules, rather than the freedom of the will to act in accordance with moral rules. Again, Kant does not say that it is strictly necessary for us to have a symbol of our moral freedom, which our aesthetic experience of freedom can supply. But he does seem to assume that the experience of beauty as a symbol of the morally good, because of its freedom, is conducive to a morally beneficial frame of mind. He says, taste, as it were, makes possible the transition from sensible charm to the habitual moral interest without too violent a leap, by representing the imagination, even in its freedom, as purposively determinable for the understanding, and teaching us to find a free satisfaction in the objects of the senses, even without any sensible charm, unquote. Again, this claim, a claim about human moral psychology, does not require that the beautiful object have any directly moral content. It is rather a claim that the experience of beauty is psychologically conducive to moral development. In the case of art, however, Kant supposes that much art does, and indeed must have, explicitly moral content, but that this is compatible with the experience of art, nevertheless involving the free play of the imagination and thus properly aesthetic pleasure. And I should again add in parenthesis that I should be saying here fine art in Kant's sense, as Kant uses the term art more generally, like Greek techne, so it includes mechanical arts, but he makes a distinction between mechanical arts and fine arts. But I'm just using art now in sort of modern sense in which it means what Kant calls fine art. Okay, the centerpiece of Kant's theory of art is his account of genius, which he analyzes as a gift of nature to produce objects, the beauty of which goes beyond anything that can be explained by the rules that the artist consciously follows. And this means, by the way, that Kant could and should have allowed us to take an intellectual interest in the existence of artistic beauty, since that has now been argued to be just as much a product of nature as trees and rocks, just the power of nature passing through human beings as themselves part of nature. This is sort of like the second of Shaftesbury's three orders of beauty, the beauty of that which forms beautiful forms, but is itself a product, in Shaftesbury's case, of God, like everything else in nature. Specifically, Kant claims, the principle of genius, quote, is nothing other than the faculty for the presentation of aesthetic ideas, unquote, by which he means that, quote, representation of the imagination that occasions much thinking though without its being possible for any determinate thought, that is, concept, to be adequate to it, and which consequently no language attains or can make intelligible, unquote. In other words, our experience of an aesthetic idea is free play rather than rule governed. That's what makes it aesthetic, the experience of a kind of beauty. But the typical content of an aesthetic idea, Kant also supposes, is a moral idea, or ideas connected with morality, whether in its purest or in its more popular forms. He says, famously, the poet ventures to make sensible, rational ideas of invisible beings, the kingdom of the blessed, the kingdom of hell, eternity, creation, etc., as well as to make that of which there are examples in experience, for example, death, envy, and all sorts of vices, as well as love, fame, etc., sensible beyond the limits of experience with a completeness that goes beyond anything of which there is an example in nature, by means of an imagination that emulates the precedent of reason in attaining to a maximum, unquote. In other words, truly successful art, in Kant's terms, the art of genius, has moral content, yet also stimulates a free play of the imagination with that content, and thus is beautiful. Now, earlier in the text, Kant had recognized the existence of purely decorative art and forms of arts that may have content but do not always have content, such as musical fantasias without theme or text. But here in discussion of genius, he is just assuming that, as a matter of fact, all fine art has content and moral content. And indeed, he argues that art must have content if it is to retain our interest by producing pleasure for very long. He states that, quote, if the beautiful arts are not combined, whether closely or at a distance, with moral ideas, which alone carry with them a self-sufficient satisfaction, then their fate is to make, quote, the spirit dull, the object by and by loathsome, and the mind, because it is aware that its disposition is contra-purposive in the judgment of reason, dissatisfied with itself and moody, in a bad mood, end of quote. Kant must be assuming that human beings are so concerned with morality that although they can tolerate pleasures not connected to morality for a brief time, presumably as long as they're not directly opposed to the ends of morality, in which case, of course, they can't be tolerated at all. In the long run, their moral interests, our moral interests, must be served if pleasure is to endure. I take it this is a psychological assumption, although the one that Kant at least finds plausible. He also assumes that ultimately artistic beauty can satisfy this requirement only in virtue of some moral content, although it's not clear why he does not allow his own account of the moral benefit of aesthetic experience, even without direct moral content, to satisfy it. Be that as it may, it should now be clear that, like other 18th century aestheticians, Kant thought that the experience of art can serve two masters. It can have moral content, yet also trigger that free play of the imagination, which is Kant's candidate for the experience of beauty. Finally, Kant completes his aesthetic theory with a thought that is closely connected to the final thought of Lord Kames's Elements of Criticism, which I didn't discuss just now for reasons of time, but was another work very important to Kant. This is the thought that the development of taste requires the, quote, culture of the mental powers through those prior forms of knowledge that are called humaniora, or humanities, presumably because humanity means, on the one hand, the universal feeling of participation, and on the other hand, the capacity for being able to communicate one's inmost self universally, which properties taken together constitute the sociability that is appropriate to humankind, by means of which it distinguishes itself from the limitation of animals, unquote. And then specifically, Kant continues, the common experience of beautiful art can facilitate the unification of people from diverse classes and backgrounds into a coherent political society. Quote, the age, as well as the peoples, in which the vigorous drive towards the lawful sociability, by means of which a people constituting an enduring commonwealth, wrestled with the great difficulties surrounding the difficult task of uniting freedom and thus also equality with coercion, more from respect and subjection to duty than from fear. Such an age and such a people had first of all to discover the art of the reciprocal communication of the ideas of the most educated part with the cruder, the coordination of the breadth and refinement of the former with the natural simplicity and originality of the latter, and in this way to discover that means between higher culture and contented nature which constitutes the correct standard, not to be given by any universal rule, for taste as a universal human sense, unquote. This extraordinary passage, which is actually a single involuted sentence of the kind that makes Kant's final critique even harder to read and translate than the previous two, makes clear that for Kant, the establishment of a just state with justice, informed by coercion if necessary, is not a matter of mere prudence or fear, but a fundamental demand of morality, even if not the whole of morality. It makes a little less clear whether the cultivation of aesthetic taste through the study of the humanities is supposed to be a propedeutic to the secure establishment of a just state or vice versa. But it does make clear that these two goals draw upon many of the same human capacities which need to be developed in both cases, and confidence that the cultivation of taste and the establishment of justice is an indispensable aim of morality, at least go hand in hand. The cultivation of taste and morality may not be identical, but for Kant they are at the very least complementary and hardly incompatible. Okay, so the paper goes on to discuss Schiller, but I've gone for almost an hour, so we'll stop there and take questions. But can you give me 1 minute to get a glass of water? I'll be right.
Please go ahead. Okay, meanwhile, I can remind that please raise your hands for the questions and I will unmute the person who is to speak. We can maybe start seeing the hands, so by the order I see, I can let the questions until Professor Geyer arrives. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Geyer. That was a real informative talk for all of us, but also it has been, at least for me personally, kind of disillusionment that several originalities that we may mistakenly attribute to Kant, actually he owes so much to his predecessors. Several themes like disinterestedness, universality, even the idea of some sort of ethical community or sensus communis maybe can be really traced back to several of his predecessors. So thanks for all of this. And
can I say one thing about that just before you go on? Because this is a point of great interest to me and something I've been working on in recent years with regard to Kant's moral philosophy and political philosophy, that namely, indeed, much of the structure and surface content of some of Kant's work is very easily traceable to predecessors. So in the case of Metaphysics of Morals, for example, the surface structure of the doctrine of right follows his textbook, Offenbach, very closely. And in the case of the doctrine of virtue, the surface structure, the particular duties that Kant enumerates and so on, follows the structure of Baumgarten's ethics very closely. But, here's the big but, it's all put on a new foundation. So just as in the case of, let's say, Offenbach's theory of natural law, the fundamental desideratum or objective of human or obligation of human beings is self-preservation, and right is derived from permissible means to self-preservation. For Kant, the foundation is freedom, and the freedom to And the underlying idea of right is that everyone should be as free as is possible to do whatever they want, consistent with the equal freedom for everybody else. And then the rights are derived from that. So here too, there's, to take the most obvious analogy, so I suggested there's this analogical structure between Hutcheson, where first he gives us this formalistic conception of beauty, but then he introduces in the second treatise poetry as the most important kind of art because it touches our moral feeling. For Kant, fine art and poetry above all becomes important as a symbol of freedom and as an expression of freedom and as conveying as its content moral ideas, which ultimately are going to trace back to the idea of freedom. So there's this surface similarity, but there's this revolution going on at the level of foundations. Anyway, go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're definitely right that there is this similarity, but yeah, the revolutionary is still there for Kantians, at least, of course. We should affirm this. The first one I have seen is Okan Bora Gülen. Okan Bey, please go ahead. You can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Professor Geyer, it was absolutely lovely listening to your talk, and I feel quite starstruck talking to you. But
thank you.
My question is a little unrelated to our topic, but it is about Kant nevertheless, and it has been puzzling me for quite some time now. It's about Kant's views about mathematics, and in the Prolegomena, and I think the Critique of Reason, which I have not been able to tackle as of yet, he regards mathematics and geometry alike as being synthetic a priori, and so something like metaphysical knowledge, at least in the model, and I was quite able to understand why Kant regards mathematics as being synthetic as opposed to analytical. And if it would not be too troubling for you at this moment, could you please elaborate a little on it?
Well, okay, this is a bit off the topic, but I'll just, and I'm hardly an expert on Kant's philosophy and mathematics, but I'll say a couple of things that might help. Kant actually says two different things. One is that conclusions in mathematics, let's call them theorems, must be synthetic a priori because, well, they're obviously a priori. They claim to be universally and necessarily true, not known on the basis of mere experience, but they cannot be proven deductively by strictly logical maneuvers or inferences from some adequate set of premises. They require the actual construction of the object, at which point one sees that one property is necessarily connected with another property, even though one can't prove it logically. You might say in this regard, he almost anticipates Gödel. But so, for example, he, in his repeated characterization of geometrical proof, he argues that you actually have to construct a figure, you actually have to bisect the line or see how two circles intersect each other to prove something. So that's one account he gives. But in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, if I remember correctly, at B14 in the introduction, he actually says that even if mathematical proof, even if geometrical proof, were to proceed strictly in accordance with the rules of logic by inference from some axioms, the results would still be synthetic as long as the axioms or the premises themselves are synthetic. If the premises are not true just in virtue of the definition of concepts, then everything that follows from them will also be synthetic. even if everything follows in accordance with logically rigorous inference. And I think that is the more plausible of the things that he has to say. Although, of course, well, anyway, I'll just stop there. But in particular, if you're puzzled by the prolegomena, look in particular at his discussion of the synthetic a priori character of mathematics in the second edition introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason.
Okay.
So I hope that is
Okay, thank you.
help.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a kind of question for clarification, but I will wait the turn and let the audience speak first. Seniye, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Gayer. It was very informative paper. My question is about your take on the third critique's general significance, and specifically how your reading of the connection between morality and aesthetics fits into that. The reason I'm asking is because in the first introduction, Kant talks about the empirical lawfulness of nature, and it seems like it's kind of not connected to aesthetics or morality. And so that's kind of one of the maybe problems, how to connect the aesthetics and teleology and to the empirical lawfulness. And the reason I'm asking is because I have Leibniz in my mind, who would say that this is the best of all possible worlds and this is the most beautiful world. And why? Because it has the most variety in terms of empirical forms with the least number of laws. And so it seems like there is some kind of, at least in the history of, of philosophy, there is this connection between empirical lawfulness and beauty of the world. So how do you fit this first introduction to your project, and what do you take? Because it seems to me that, when Kant says that in the third critique he aims to unify nature and freedom, your interpretation is that he does it by showing that morality is realizable, or the moral ideas are realizable in nature, and that's how freedom and nature are unified. So this seems very appealing and correct, but how would you then incorporate this maybe theoretical aspect of aesthetics to this moral?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a huge question, and I've gone back and forth about various parts of it over the years. I think you're, just to say in passing, your reference to Leibniz here is extremely interesting, because Leibniz is picking out as the criterion for the best of all possible worlds what we regard as an aesthetic criterion, and which Hutcheson used as his account of the aesthetic, uniformity amidst variety. Well, I don't know what precisely to do with that, but the idea that in some sense there's an aesthetic premise underlying Leibniz's whole approach to philosophy, and that could to some extent explain why aesthetics as a discipline was developed by Leibnizian philosophers, Wolff and Baumgarten. But okay, on the question of how the third critique fits together, various things to say. One thing that Kant says in the second introduction, the published introduction, is that he found it necessary, he thinks this third work will bridge the great gulf or chasm that exists between the legislation of the laws of nature on the one hand and the laws of freedom on the other hand. But as soon as you read that, you have to ask yourself, what gulf exactly? Hadn't Kant already shown in the Critique of Practical Reason that nature is consistent with morality because we have to postulate the existence of an author of the laws of nature that is also moral, namely God. So there should be no gulf. He has established that, I mean, we are entitled to believe in the existence of a God who's, who unites laws of nature and morality, and that we are entitled to believe that we ourselves are free and therefore are able to act morally even when we are acting in nature. So what gulf is left? Well, the way I have tried to understand this is that, yeah, all that is true about Kant's philosophy in the 1780s, but that it remains, and remains in his own view, very abstract, and that human beings who are both sensible and rational need more concrete, more sensible evidence or grounds for conviction of this fundamental connection. And so we get these various things going on in the third critique, namely the argument about intellectual interest in the existence of beauty in nature as evidence for nature's being receptive to our morality, the argument about the experience of natural beauty as a symbol of the morally good. And then we get this whole elaborate argument in the critique of teleological judgment that says essentially, well, we have to introduce the notion of purposiveness and at least a reflective judgment about the existence of a designer and therefore a purpose for all of nature in order to make any sense at all of some parts of nature, namely organisms. But once we introduce the idea of the purposiveness of nature as a whole and of a designer of nature as a whole, we have to then come up with some idea of the purpose of nature, the point of the design, and that has to be something of unconditional value. And the only candidate for anything of unconditional value that we have is the realization of our own morality. So this whole complicated story about the judgment of organisms, and starting from specific Aristotelian and Buffonian properties of organisms that have to be understood in terms of purposiveness, all that whole thing leads up to the idea that we have to ultimately, once again, think of nature as an arena for the realization of human morality. I mean, certain aspects of human morality, namely freedom as such, stand outside of nature, according to Kant, but they have to be efficacious in nature. So, so just as in the first half of the book, he starts off with the experience of beauty as something that is concrete isn't the right word, but something palpable, something that people experience in their real empirical lives, and ultimately shows the moral significance of that. So in the second half, he starts off with, once again, something sensible, namely our experience of organisms, and ends up with showing how that too leads to morality. So he's giving us these various ways in which, as creatures who are both rational and sensible, morality and nature get tied together. Now, what exactly happens in the introduction? That's problematic. I mean, some of what happens in the introduction, or in both drafts of the introduction, is setting up the machinery for this large argument, but then there's the very specific issue that you raised about the status of particular laws of nature. I mean, I tend to, well, in the past, I went to the first introduction for clarification of Kant's account of free play, but to the second introduction on this issue, You know, he gives there's this little argument. I mean, it's big, maybe in consequences, little in the amount of space it takes up, that, okay, the most general laws of nature are given to us just by the categories, or more precisely by the combination of the categories with the a priori forms of intuition. Those are the principles of empirical judgment analyzed in the Critique of Pure Reason. But how do we get from there to particular laws of nature, like laws about photosynthesis and combustion and fission and fusion, or, you know, whatever you name? They are not implied by the general principles. But Kant says, insofar as they are to be counted as laws, they still have to have, we have to be able to see them as being necessarily true. And so then he gives us this image. Well, they're parts of a complete system of laws, from the most general to the most particular, that we ourselves are not at any particular point in complete possession of, but which we think of as if it were intended by a creator, and so on and so forth. And that is giving them their lawfulness. So, okay, that argument is sort of independent of what follows in the book, because that's an argument that's, so to speak, fleshing out the argument of the first critique, showing us how we get to theoretical laws, theoretical but particular laws of nature, and it doesn't have anything to do with the special case of beauty, nor anything to do with the special case of organisms. But it still is part of, perhaps, of the general project of how we connect our most abstract conceptions with our actual sensible experience. And the first critique and the second critique tell us that we have to be able to do that. And the third critique explores the various ways in which, according to Kant, we actually do it. And I think actually that throughout, in a way, well, put it this way, Kant's project in the 1780s was to, as he puts it in the introduction to in the preface to the groundwork, was to seek out and establish, or place on a firm foundation, the fundamental laws of actually both theory and practice, that is, the fundamental laws of theoretical thought and the moral law, on the other hand. This project of the 1790s is to show how those fundamental principles are applied in actual human experience. I mean, an obvious model for that is the Metaphysics of Morals of 1797, which in its introduction includes a statement that we now have to see what follows from the fundamental moral laws, which are true for all rational beings, for human beings with their particular nature and in their particular circumstances, like living on the surface of the globe, any point of which can be reached from any other point, and so on and so forth. So we've already established the most general principles. Now what we see is how those principles are actually implied, given some very general empirical claims about human nature and human circumstances. And I think that project sort of begins with the third critique and goes all the way through to the Metaphysics of Morals. I hope that's something of an answer.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two more questions, but mine is actually a kind of follow-up for this. Maybe I can just jump in. That is, so in this regard, should we understand that your use of moral psychology, or aesthetics being conducive to moral psychology, is in a sense both different from a need of reason, but also at the same time different from a need of inclination? Because in general, I feel like how to understand kind of a moral psychological need in the Kantian context, considering all his ideas, the impossibility of rational psychology, etc. Because he on the one hand make a distinction with what would mean that a reason, need of reason would mean, which is not selfish, which is open to all rational beings, but in particular a need for us as human beings, rational beings. But it is not at the same time a need of inclination. So how should we understand? Because in my back mind, I'm also thinking about God, Kant's conception of God, that as a need of reason we need it. But here we're talking about some sort of other need, but still seems to be relevant, not purely empirical, and in this sense, not about empirical psychology. What is the connection of these kind of needs you would think of?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question, because Kant wants to claim that in certain ways judgment of taste is a priori, and that they rest on a priori principle. And he states a fundamental principle of reflective judgment in the introduction, which doesn't seem to bear very clearly on the aesthetic case. I take it that in the deduction of aesthetic judgments of taste in section 38, and in the preparation for that in section 21, where he is asserting essentially that all human minds work in the same way, he takes that to be an a priori principle. I think he's just wrong about that. So he can argue that, he can argue, let's say, that the moral law is an a priori principle because it's valid for all rational beings and can be derived, he thinks, from the concept of rational being. But clearly, the derivation of particular duties from the moral law requires empirical inputs. People are sometimes confused about that. Sometimes even super smart people like Arthur Ripstein in his Force and Freedom book on Kant's political philosophy says at one point that all of Kant's statements about duties in the doctrine of right must be a priori. That's clearly wrong. The fundamental principle is a priori, but then you have to make additional empirical assumptions. Okay, so now I'm beginning to lose the thread, but the various claims about what can be conducive, about how, for example, the experience of the beautiful prepares us to love something independent of interest, and the experience of the sublime prepares us to love something even against our interest. Those kinds of claims, it seems to me, can only be understood as claims about human psychology that in principle are empirical, subject to empirical confirmation or disconfirmation. Just another example in which in the episodic section in the Doctrine of Virtue, where Kant discusses our obligations to non-human nature, and he's making the assumption that non-human nature, whether we're talking about minerals or other animals, are not rational beings, don't have direct moral standing, but that nevertheless we need to treat them humanely because the way in which we treat them rubs off on the way in which we treat other human beings. That can only be understood as an empirical claim that could be confirmed or disconfirmed by some form of empirical psychology. I mean, he doesn't say otherwise there. He doesn't claim this is a priori. But it seems to me that, so to speak, the epistemic status of that claim is precisely the same character as these claims that he makes in
Duties of Virtue,
the critique of aesthetic judgment, about what prepares us for morality and so on. So I think it's okay. It's all okay. It makes perfectly good sense as long as we understand that, the fundamental principle of morality is a priori, But then we have to see how that is actually applied and made effective by human beings constituted in the way that we are, and that requires empirical knowledge. I mean, of course, Kant is, he can sound very hostile to empiricism at times because but let's say at the beginning of section 2 of the groundwork, because he doesn't want the fundamental principle of morality to be grounded on merely empirical evidence, because then it'll be valid for this person, but not valid for that person, and so on and so forth. But that's only about the fundamental principle. And then the further claims about the kinds of duties that arise from the fundamental principle and this kind of steps that we need to take can and must involve some empirical assumptions.
Okay, so this is in a sense then when I think of moral psychology, we should mostly associate it with a rather anthropological sense in this regard, not to consider maybe the all sort of negativity Kant associate with all sort of empirical psychology, right? These are
right.
rather belonging something to our species. As
yes.
Both of the beings that we are. Okay,
yes.
This is helpful. Thank you. We have a question from Özgüç Güven, but his microphone is not working, so I will read his question. He asks, how did Kant read all these English-speaking philosophers? Are all of the cited works translated into German or only some parts? Did he have a direct connection with them or the works of other commentators?
I think that all of the works I referred to were available to him in German translations. There was a very big business of translating British works into German, not the other way around. And things were translated very quickly. So, for example, we all know that Hume's treatise of human nature was not translated into German completely until quite late in Kant's career, and that he may never have read all of it. But the enquiries, the first enquiry concerning human understanding, which from 1748, and the enquiry concerning the principles of morals from 1751, were translated into German already in 1754 or 5. Kames's Elements of Criticism, which came out in English in 1762, was translated already into German in 1766. Hutcheson's first inquiry was translated into German by none other than Johann Joachim Spalding in the 1740s. And also Hutcheson's System of Morals, a posthumous work, his most extensive work, which came out in 1755, was translated very quickly into German. I don't remember the exact date here, but when Kant was occupied with those texts in the 1760s. Hutcheson also published himself in Latin a short version of his moral philosophy in 1742. So, of course, Kant could read that. So the answer is yes, he knew these works directly. I mean, also, if you look at German literary life in Kant's lifetime in the especially in the 1770s and 80s, but even beginning sooner than that, I guess. You look at these things like and almost every university town had one, like the Goethischen Gelehrte Anzeichen and so on and so forth. They reviewed many books, or you look at Nicolai's Bibliothek der schönen Kunst and so on that Mendelssohn contributed to in the 1760s. They reviewed many books. They reviewed books in French and German quickly, and the character of the reviews was chiefly informative. I mean, mostly the reviews described the contents of the books under review, and then they would have a few critical comments, but they were very descriptive. So it was possible for someone who read several of those journals to be incredibly well informed about what was happening in the intellectual world of all of Europe. But in the case of these specific works, they were all translated into German. And 20 years ago, Heiner Klemme and Manfred Kuhn edited for a publisher that doesn't exist anymore called Themis, a whole, I think, 7-volume series of the German translations, as the contemporaneous, the 18th century German translations of Kant's sources for his aesthetics. And it's got Hutcheson and Shaftesbury and Hume and all of this stuff in the 18th century translations from English into German.
Okay. Professor Geyer, if your time allows, we have 3 more questions and I would love to receive them briefly. Would that be okay for you? Because I promised 2 minutes.
By all means.
Okay.
I'll try to be brief in my answer too.
No, it's not about our timing. We're happy to listen, but not to steal more of your time. Okay, Merve, yes, thank you. Go ahead, please, Merve. Thanks for your patience, by the way. You've been waiting. Yes, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much for the talk. I have actually a simple-minded question. So I'm curious about what Kant thinks about the literature, which the purpose of which is not to arouse aesthetic feelings at all, but the opposite. I think Marquis de Sade is his contemporary. And yeah, so and yeah, maybe we can say that he's just describing things as it is without trying to make us moral or educating. So does Kant say anything about this kind of literature, or does he leave them out from the discussion?
He pretty much leaves them out. He certainly doesn't refer to Sade or Casanova or anybody like that. He did read some novels, and in fact, in the correspondence with his publisher about the printing and editions and so on of the Critique of Judgment, and the publisher owes him money. He asks the publisher for a gift of a 6-part novel the publisher had also published, but I don't remember the name of it now, and I don't know that anyone's ever read it. It's not clear that Kant ever read it, but no, he doesn't talk about that kind of literature. His examples, his chief example is Paradise Lost, and he quotes, some other uplifting poetry from Albrecht von Haller and from Friedrich der Zweite, and so on, but he doesn't talk about other kinds of literature. Sorry.
Okay, not much surprise. Yeah, Kant is famous for not giving super examples, unfortunately. İmran Hanım, you have a question. You were the first to ask among the waiter once. You can unmute yourself now.
Thank you very much for your paper, Mr. Geyer. As you told, if we consider aesthetic idea of Kant, we know nature, beauty, fine arts mostly rather than poetry. It was good to hear Kant aesthetic idea related poetry. In we consider history of philosophy about poetry, we usually make a connection between Aristotle and Heidegger. Can we make a connection Aristotle, Kant, and Heidegger? What do you think about it? Thank you very much.
Well, That's a very interesting question. I wouldn't make a direct connection between either, I think. I mean, Aristotle, of course, the most famous claim, perhaps, of the Poetics is that drama is about human action. That Kant does not say that. I mean, he doesn't say, he doesn't say very much, but both in section 49, where he's expounding the theory of aesthetic ideas, and in the comparison of the different arts to each other, sections 51 and 53, he continually emphasizes that poetry captures these ideas and is superior to all the other art forms because it is better at capturing ideas. But what are the ideas? I mean, the ideas are the kinds of things I mentioned, ideas of heaven and hell, virtue and vice, and so on and so forth. It might be that in what we would regard as the best poetry, these are illustrated by human actions, or it's better to present these ideas by presenting human beings as motivated by these ideas. But Kant does not certainly explicitly say anything like that. So I guess I would say that his conception of poetry is much more abstract than Aristotle's. I mean, Aristotle does say, of course, famously, that poetry also presents us with universals, whereas history presents us with particulars. But he seems to be thinking of types of action, so actions and events. So, poetry presents us with these mythologically based stories about what happens if this kind of person does that kind of thing, whereas history presents us with fact-based accounts of this person actually doing that thing. But he's not thinking in terms of this, I think, of the same kinds of abstractions that Kant is talking about. And then as far as Heidegger is concerned, of course, such a comparison would be completely anachronistic, but and I'm hardly an expert on Heidegger, actually. I hate Heidegger, but as a Nazi and so on. Nevertheless, I mean, Heidegger's view of art was actually created at the peak of his Nazi period in the middle of the 1930s. It's about, letting being shine forth. It's not about letting specific ideas. And in particular, it's not about letting specifically moral ideas shine forth or reveal themselves to us or anything of that sort. It's about letting, being itself reveal itself to us, which I find to be, first of all, kind of meaningless. But I mean, what does being mean here? In Kant's language, existence is not a predicate, after all. But more importantly, of course, for Kant, it's moral ideas that are to be the ultimate content of great art, and it takes the active work of genius to find good, interesting, beautiful ways to express and communicate those ideas. Nobody's just opening themselves up to some profound ideas. It is the height of human creativity to find ways to express and communicate these ideas. That's the core of Kant's theory of genius. So I think it's very different from, without saying anything more about Heidegger, I think it is very different from Heidegger's approach to art.
Okay, we have two more waiting questions. Elif Çırakman, unfortunately, I think we are not be able to accept the rest of the questions, but Elif Hocam, please go ahead.
Professor Gaye, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. My question is a bit of a follow-up of what Saniye had asked, and it is regarding the unity within the third critique, regarding it had two parts, one aesthetic and the other one is a teleological judgment. And I want to hear a bit more on what would you think about the significance of culture as a unifying theme of these two parts of the book regarding the aesthetic judgment and teleological judgment, given the fact that finally he points to culture as the ultimate purpose, not the final purpose, as Puluhar translates it. But, and given that we can define culture as nature as being receptive to our moral demands, and to change culture, to cultivate our nature and nature itself as well. And nature has somehow subjectively and objectively purposive for this kind of a precondition of morality, which is culture, actually, on which freedom can be realized. And I want to hear a bit on that point, whether it's a unifying point in which these two parts of the book can complement each other. Thank you.
That's an extremely interesting question. And what I would say is it's sort of a promising question, because what Kant has to say about culture is so very brief. Now, one thing that your question, it makes me realize, I hadn't really thought about this before, was that in a sense, both the first half and the second half conclude with a point about culture. And I mean, the one striking structural anomaly is that in the critique of aesthetic power of judgment, the doctrine of method is a single section of a couple of pages, whereas in the critique of the teleological power, the doctrine of method is this very long section, a third of the book, consisting of well over 10 sections. In the section 60, which concludes the critique of the aesthetic power of judgment, I quoted from that. There, Kant is talking about aesthetic culture. So, and I think he uses the word culture there as that which bridges the gap between the different classes in a society, or which may do that. So by culture there, he's referring to something like sort of I'm trying to think of a nice word for this, the aesthetic wealth and property of a society available in its various ways to different strata of that society. That's highly abstract, but I mean, you know, it could be something like mythology plus the architecture plus the poetry, etc., of a society that somehow plays this function. Now, what he is in sections 83 and 84, in the doctrine and method of the critique of the teleological power of judgment, it's the culture of discipline that is the ultimate end of nature, but not the final end of nature. It's rather the precondition for the final end. It's something to be that can be achieved in the empirical world that helps us realize the consequences of our freedom, etc. It's conditions for the empirical realization and efficacy of morality. So it's kind of more specific than what he's talking about in section 60. But nevertheless, maybe there is some way to develop a Kantian theory of culture which brings these different aspects of culture together, and then that would turn out to be, in fact, a connecting theme of the two halves. But a lot would need to be filled in. I think it's a great idea. I hope you write a book about it.
Okay, thank you. We have, I think, now can accept the last question. Lale Levin Bosut, please go ahead. You were waiting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Geyer, for your talk. You had many references to many moments in the history of philosophy. My question would be about Kant's claim, the claim that you have quoted, that which is beautiful is cognized without a concept. You have said, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, this might actually have nothing to do with subsuming. I still do have a hunch it might have something to do with subsuming, and I would very much like to hear your opinion about it. Can Kant be making a comparison here between the concepts of the understanding, their construction and their consecutive usage, and the forming of the idea of the beautiful? Since with the concepts of the understanding setting off from a like, that means gleichartige manifolds, we merge these into a representation we call the concept. This concept then gives us a rule into the hand with the help of which we can cognize the particulars when we subsume the manifold under this concept. And this situation, however, is quite different with the beautiful. It's not like we can run through possible beautiful objects and then after so many encounters, construct the rule or the concept of the beautiful, which we can use afterwards for distinguishing or cognizing beautiful objects. So there is apparently, according to what I have understood at least, no rule of the beautiful, no concept of the understanding for the beautiful. What would you say to all of this? Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything you say seems right. So let's go back for a second to Kant's famous example from the Logic about a concept formation and, you know, his argument how we form these concepts of different trees, elms, lindens, etc., by noticing certain similarities and certain differences. These were all deciduous trees. I don't remember if he mentions firs or spruces, but my examples are deciduous trees. So they have roots, trunk, and crown. They have leaves that come out in the spring and drop in the fall, etc. But there are differences in their shapes and the shapes of the leaves and so on. So we can subsume them on the one hand under a general concept like tree or even deciduous tree that brings out their similarities, but then we can subsume particular instances under more particular concepts like elm or linden or maple or oak that emphasize differences among these kinds of trees, right? But the crucial point here is that once we have a concept like tree or a concept like elm or oak or whatever, it gives us a set of criteria, at least in theory. I mean, in practice, it gets a little more complicated, but in theory, at least, it gives us a set of criteria or predicates such that if any particular object satisfies those criteria or those predicates, then it counts as a tree, it counts as an elm tree. In other words, here we have concepts that can function as rules. So we form the concept of elm with its various differentia, and then anything that satisfies that concept counts as an elm tree. And Kant's claim is that there is nothing like that that happens in the case of the aesthetic. There's no finite set of features such that if an object has those features, it counts as beautiful, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not like that. The individual beautiful object, it's supposed to have subjectively universal validity. Everyone's supposed to agree that this particular object is beautiful, but it's not a judgment about a class of objects. I mean, that's his claim, and that's been taken up by various people. Dilthey famously makes a similar point against Fechner, and so on, and it seems to be pretty widely accepted. My point about the point that I alluded to is that, or the way I put this point is that beautiful objects, of course, are always subsumable under some concepts or others. I mean, they're subsumable both under the categories, but also under more particular concepts, like the concept of scallop shell or the concept of a Haydn string quartet. But those kinds of concepts, which do in principle have definite criteria associated with them, never suffice to explain why this particular instance is beautiful. For that, we always have to go to the actual experience. And there's no actual rule that tells us, you know, this is what it takes to be a beautiful Haydn string quartet. It has to not only have 4 movements in ABA form, but it has to have such and such and such and such. No, you don't get that kind of rule, right? So that's the point I wanted to make. So it's completely consistent with what you were saying, I think.
Okay, I think I should now close the session. We already exceed 20 minutes. I would really like to thank you, Professor Gayer. It was really joyful for us to listen to you in person and also to be able to ask our questions. And also I want to thank everyone who attended and did not leave us alone tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Okay. Hope to see you in some other occasion, maybe in person in Istanbul next time again. Okay.
I hope so.
Okay. Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks for being tonight with us.